Well, hello. So delighted to be here amongst you in this great community of amazing people. Also honored to be here with Jessica to moderate your very powerful, amazing book, centered focus on unconscious bias. And so in your book, you do such a great job of taking a holistic approach. You use several different methods of investigation, and you also raise a lot of critical questions to help us elevate our understanding of bias. And so for our first question, if you could just share with us how you came into this work, how you came into this research, and what is your unique angle as it relates to unconscious bias?
So I'd been working as a journalist for many years, writing about bias and discrimination. And as journalists, we focus on problems. We tend to describe wrongdoing. We articulate what is going badly, and then we try to persuade you, the reader, to care about this problem that we've uncovered. That's generally how a lot of journalism works. And I started to become a little bit impatient with that approach, to be perfectly honest. I had been writing about bias and discrimination from that perspective, really thinking about it as a problem and trying to understand the problem and describe the problem and show how impactful this was. And I really wanted to understand what to do about it. And so the first thing I thought was, well, I'll find the book that's been written about how people change and how bias decreases, and then I'll know what I need to know about solving this. And I couldn't find that book. So I set out to try to write the book that I was looking for, which was a really thorough exploration of what changes people's behavior and what changes organizations and what changes cultures to become more fair, more just, and more humane. And so I thought it was going to take about 18 months. It took 5 years. It was a much more thorny project than I sort of envisioned when I was starting it. But my angle is really looking at the data. So I'm interested in measurable change. It's often when we talk about anti-bias interventions or anti-discrimination interventions, we don't necessarily evaluate their impact. And I'm very interested in impact. My background is in science, and so I'm kind of constantly attuned. What does the data say? What is actually going on? And how can we measure whether this is actually making a meaningful impact in the way that we want it to? And so the book looks at what works. I tell stories about people and organizations and cultures that have actually changed in measurable ways, and then try to explain and explore what allowed them to do that.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. In terms of your data-driven approach, we're often, that's the criticism of DEI, especially in spaces of academia. And so, yes, in your book, there's several powerful vignettes really diving into some of these issues that we're still grappling with, that we don't necessarily have the solutions, right? We're always in a sense of being a problem based in terms of framing DEI, but yes, we need more of the resolutions to those things. But it's difficult, right? Given that we aren't living in a vacuum. We're in the workplace trying to figure out how to have more equitable outcomes, how to create a climate of inclusiveness. But in our society, when we think about what happens in our neighborhoods, what happens at our schools, there are people still practicing, incivility. These are people who sometimes have, power to make change, but not the change that we need. And so I am curious to if you can, I guess, expand on some of the practices in organizations that you think have been the most effective for reducing bias, unconscious bias.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of approaches that have demonstrated some efficacy. You know, one approach that I think is really interesting that it's actually from the healthcare world, but it applies to, I think, organizations more generally, is an approach that was taken up at Johns Hopkins University. And so in this situation, there was a group of trauma surgeons who were trying to understand how to improve trauma care across the hospital. And what they found was that people weren't getting adequate care, and particularly, they weren't getting adequate blood clot prevention. And so that's really important because if you have a blood clot, it can lead to really bad outcomes. Pulmonary embolisms were at a higher rate than they should have been at this hospital. And so these surgeons got together really to try to improve care, to try to improve blood clot prevention. And so they introduced something that's pretty well known in healthcare, which is a checklist. And what they did was they changed the decision-making process for doctors so that when patients came to be assessed for blood clot prevention, instead of a doctor doing what they would normally do, which is use clinical judgment. You know, if I'm the doctor, I would use my clinical judgment to sort of figure out whether you, the patient, would need blood clot prevention if we were, you know, doctor-patient. Instead, the doctors now were asked to use a computerized checklist. And so instead of just using their clinical judgment, they actually had a set of criteria, a consistent set of criteria that they used in every patient encounter. So what was interesting about this approach was that after the introduction of this computerized checklist, blood clot prevention improved enormously. People were getting appropriate prevention at much higher rates than they had been before. But what was really interesting was when they looked at what happened to disparities. So after the intervention, they went back and they looked at the data, and they found that women were getting blood clot prevention at a much lower rate. They were almost 50% more likely to miss out on appropriate treatment than men. After the intervention, the gender disparity disappeared. And what's interesting about this example, there are a few interesting things about it. One is the doctors weren't actually instructed to decrease their bias. It wasn't specifically a bias intervention. It was an intervention to improve decision-making in general. But by creating an objective set of criteria with which doctors made decisions, they were able to actually decrease discrimination as well. And this is actually something that's been shown in the corporate world. One approach that decreases discrimination against women and underrepresented minorities in corporate environments, in terms of their ability to be promoted into management, is using objective criteria, using consistent, objective, transparent criteria for making decisions. And so that's, you know, it's an example that I find interesting because it's not so much about changing hearts and minds as it is about changing the decision-making environment, like changing the structure within which people make a decision so that their own biases are less likely to play a role.
Awesome. Yeah, in terms of structure and process, leading that change. But to be honest, as I'm thinking about this in unconscious bias as it relates to those who have a history and present reality of being minoritized, sometimes it seems, or it's framed in a way where unconscious bias is for those mainly in the dominant culture as a draw to, I guess, increase awareness, because that's where we all start, right? Step one, understand. Understand how you might be contributing to these pervasive, oppressive systems that we have. What does that do for those who are oppressed? And even sometimes, I guess, when we do have these remedies in terms of structure process, for example, managers might, have a quota for how many minorities, BIPOC, that they promote. But people know how to get around those things.
Yes.
Just give everyone flying colors on your team, and then you're back to square one about, well, who do you promote now? If everyone's doing well, you go from that objectivity to being in that subjective space.
Yes.
And then when we think about testing, the Harvard bias tests, and even training that takes place at work, unconscious bias has been, gaining a lot of traction when it comes to DEI work. We need implicit bias training. Well, everyone knows how to take a test. You're not going to say all these crazy, horrible things, even if you might think them, especially at work. You know how to navigate that process. So how effective is it really? And so I'm in that space.
Yeah.
That critical diversity perspective, but also acknowledging the value in, pro-diversity action, that we need to be doing something. But I'm not sure at times if unconscious bias is gauging everyone to, have the same benefit at the very least. And so in your book, you talk about actually reconceptualizing what it means to go from unconscious bias, but maybe unexamined bias. Can you speak more about how we should be thinking about unconscious bias?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much I want to respond
Sorry.
to what you just said.
Sorry.
I mean, I'll take that question, then I want to go back to some stuff you said earlier, because it's really important. So in the psychology field, for the last 30 years, there's been this idea that there are two kinds of bias. There's prejudice, which is what we recognize as overt, hate speech, homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism. There's this kind of prejudice that is what we see when we hear white nationalists talk about, white superiority. That's overt prejudice that's based in deeply held beliefs. Okay, so that's one thing. And then there's this idea in psychology that there's another kind, the second kind of bias, which is unconscious bias. And this is a kind of bias that is a product of living in a culture. It's sort of passively received information that then gets stored in our memory as associations and stereotypes. And that knowledge gets triggered when we encounter someone who we recognize as belonging to a social category that we have stored in our memory. And that this happens very quickly and automatically, and it has nothing to do with what we really believe. Okay, so that's kind of the conceptual model that psychology has been working with for decades. But I find this model troubling. And there's sort of a less maybe prominent strain in psychology that sees these kinds of bias not as two separate things, but more as a continuum. And I have come to believe more in that model, because I just don't think, based on my research, based on all of the reporting I've done, based on my observation of the world, I don't think it's that black and white. I think that sometimes there are biases that we hold that might actually be related to things we believe but we have not examined. that we have not really looked closely at. And I think this is an important distinction, because if we are holding beliefs that we haven't examined and we're acting on those, that requires a different kind of approach than associations that we've passively absorbed that we're just kind of thoughtlessly, going around the world, acting out. And I've come to believe that there's actually an element of deep personal introspection and deep grappling with our belief system, with our values, that is actually really required here. Yeah. And so I've come to call it unexamined bias, because I think that better captures the fact that there's a kind of unknowable combination of conscious and unconscious things happening.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. But in that, I think it's still, the ownership is on the individual. But does that, us as individuals, do we actually have that agency?
Yes.
To, examine ourselves in a way where we're in the right situation to do that? I mean, again, going back to my previous comment, if we're still under these oppressive systems that are the pillars in our world, that run our society, is it on us, starting at the individual level, to make that change? Is it even possible?
That's a great, do you have a
yes.
second part? Okay,
no, I do.
I'm ready to jump in.
Okay, because you talk about this in your book, and I want to go to where you talk about it in your book. But if you want to go ahead and say something, I mean, this is your show.
No, I just wanted to say, I'm just thinking back to something you said earlier about how you can change a structure, like you can tell, managers that they need to have a certain kind of requirement, but people can get around that structure.
Yeah.
And so I really believe that there needs to be individual change as well. There needs to be work on hearts and minds, but that's not enough, because there are structures and institutions that absolutely shape the way that we interact with one another and behave. So sometimes there's this conversation about, is it more, should the responsibility be on the individual, or is it a structural issue? I think you can't separate them. Because where do structures come from? People, we make them. We enforce policies, we pass laws, we vote for people. We choose not to support policies or not to pass laws. And so the structures aren't like sort of supernatural things coming down from the heaven. Like, these are human inventions.
We can change.
So if we change ourselves, then I think that can give us the courage and the creativity to change the structures as well.
Yes, and I think we're on the same page. I want to make that clear. I am a champion of her work. I support her work. But, is this level of introspection just isn't talked about in the way that it should. And I think you get at that in your book here. So yeah, is this right here? Okay. Yes. If you could read this, I think this is what I was trying to, explain, but you do it in a much graceful way here. If you want to go ahead.
So this is a section from toward the end of the book where I'm talking a little bit about the history that we share in this country and what happens when we don't grapple with that history. If a person and a family can carry a moral injury, perhaps so can a nation and its people. This country, among many, has not yet faced the depths of its crimes, starting with the atrocities committed against the land's first inhabitants and with slavery. It has not reckoned with the resulting injuries to its citizens or mutilation of its own moral center. This is how history becomes psychology, how the rituals of the past become the reflexes of the present. Without confronting the past, we cannot understand it, and we cannot take the actions required to repair it.
Told you, much better than what I said. That's where I'm stuck sometimes, but yes, we do need to, have these ways in which we're focusing on certain aspects of DEI. Sometimes it seems like when we're talking about DEI, like everybody's at the table, but it's really contextualized to different groups. And unfortunately, that leads to us being in silos still. We talk about DEI, but is there really unity? we talk about equitable outcomes, inclusive environments, and diversity for certain groups at certain times, because we each have our own different histories, right? We need different things. And so, we all know it's a mess, but we're still in its infancy. We haven't been talking about this we should have been talking about this since the beginning of time, but there has always been people who want to, just keep power to themselves and overpower people. And we're beginning to have these new generations where they're breaking those cycles. And so I say all of this to get to the title of the book. The title of the book, Ending Bias. Can we end unconscious bias?
Yeah, the book is called The End of Bias, but the subtitle is A Beginning, because I think we will always have human judgment with us. We will probably always bring our experiences and our ignorances to bear on our encounters with one another and our relating to the world. But I think we can do so much better than we have historically and than we are now. And I think about it kind of like, if you remember in math class, like the asymptote, there's like a line, and then if you have an equation that gets asymptotically close to it, it like gets close to the line, but it never maybe quite gets there, but it gets closer and closer and closer. I think maybe we can get closer, we can get a lot closer, and we can do a lot better, and we can relate to each other in much more humane ways than we have. And that's really my goal with the book, is to kind of, wherever we are, to move us more in the right direction. There's a saying in the Jewish tradition, which I'm part of, which is, you are not required to finish the work, but neither are you allowed to desist from it. And I feel like we all have not only the capacity, but the responsibility to contribute to moving things more in the direction that creates the world that we need, frankly, the world that we need.
Yes. No, I agree with what you are saying, that there may not be the eradication that we want of racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, all of those isms, but we still all have a responsibility to work towards a better way of being. And so, again, thank you so very much for this work. I think we have time. Oh, actually, we have no more time. Yeah, that was all of our time. This has been a very enriching experience. Yeah, no, I got more. But yes, thank you, Jessica, for this work.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all.